Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Dudley Costello, The Haunted House in Yorkshire. There is scarcely any accusation which men repel with greater earnestness than the suspicion of yielding to a belief in preternatural visitations, and yet there are very few who do not, at some period in their lives, tacitly, if not openly, admit the possibility of such occurrences. Negative proofs abound to demonstrate the existence of this belief, a familiar instance of which is shown in the eagerness with which stories of this nature are invariably listened to, less from a love of the marvelous, or a desire to combat the statements made, though these, no doubt, combine their influence, than from its secret and mysterious attraction towards the subject, akin to our belief in the soul's immortality, which leads us, with a kind of willing dread, beyond the limits of this world. Who is there that ever refused to listen to a good ghost story, or did not incline to draw nearer when the preparation was being made for telling one, or would willingly have lost a syllable of the wondrous tale? There are none within my own recollection, and not many, I think, in that of others. But proofs of a more positive kind are to be found in the relations of persons of so much credit and good sense, that to doubt their veracity, or ascribe their narratives to the effect of a heated imagination, are alike unjust and improbable. It is so much easier to hazard a conjecture than adduce a sufficient reason against the non-existence of what we cannot understand. And the casuist's love of applause is so much greater than his desire for the truth, that ingenious arguments are often suffered to prevail, in spite of innate conviction. Ocular and oral deceptions, coincidences, a mind excited or predisposed, low spirits, a bad conscience, or, what often amounts to the same thing, a bad digestion, are usually held to be the causes, as they have sometimes been the concomitants of tales of sprites and goblins. Yet all these have been known to fail of application some of the best authenticated ghost stories, as, amongst others, all who remember the spirit witnessed by Sir John Sherbrooke in the West Indies will agree. And the most skeptical are often compelled to shroud their conviction in the admission that such or such an occurrence is certainly rather extraordinary and, indeed, difficult to be accounted for. I do not know whether the story which I have to tell belongs to any of the classes whose solution is easy to find. For one is apt to judge ill in one's own case, but to me it has always remained an unfathomable mystery. It is now about 15 years since a friend of mine, named Beaumont, was living near the town of H, in the West Riding of Yorkshire. He was about 30 years of age, a man of firm nerves and clear intellect, whose education and subsequent intercourse with the world had been such as to render his mind impervious to superstitious influences. He had been married early in life to a young and beautiful girl, and but that they had no family, there was nothing wanting to make his domestic felicity complete. Beaumont's circumstances were good, and events occurred which made him even affluent. But with this augmentation to his fortune came the desire, or rather, considering his position in the county, the necessity for removing to a dwelling of greater pretension than he had hitherto occupied. It happened that Ashfield House was at this time to let. It was a large mansion, standing in a fine position above a beautiful valley, amid scenery of the most picturesque description. There was everything in its situation to render it an attractive residence, but in the house itself there was, in popular estimation, one drawback. It had the reputation, throughout the county, of being haunted. This opinion was founded upon no antique tradition, for Ashfield was one of recent construction, and the person who built it had died only a few years before. But it was the manner of his death, and that of his sister, a short time before his own, which had cast a shadow over its walls. The history of the first occupants was variously narrated, but the generally received version was that both had committed suicide. There could be no doubt that this was the fact with respect to the brother, for the details of the coroner's inquest were clear and conclusive, and lived in everyone's recollection. But this was far from being the case in the instance of the sister. The precise circumstances of her death were shrouded in mystery, and it is a most doubtful point with many whether she had actually died by her own hands, as the story was given out to the world, or had fallen by those of another. Though there was nothing that could directly incriminate him, suspicion pointed at the brother, and whether it were remorse or grief no one could tell. But exactly at 12 months from the day on which the lady was found dead in her bedroom, from the effects of poison, he was discovered a corpse in the same chamber, having shot himself through the heart. It would seem that their previous lives had been anything but happy. Both were possessed of wealth. They had manifested no signs of affection towards each other, living much apart, though under the same roof, and a powerful necessity rather than a bond of love appeared to be the tie that united their fortunes. The sister was silent and sad, rarely stirring abroad, and, when she did so, never going beyond the precincts of their dwelling. The brother was more frequently seen, but its habits were no less gloomy and reserved. He made no acquaintance, and his principal occupation, for it scarcely seemed a pleasure, was that of riding around the country alone, either slowly, lost in thought, or galloping wildly, as if to drown it in excitement. A mystery hung over their lives, and the fearful manner of their deaths tended to increase it. Their own actions, surmised or real, were sufficient to create the impression that universally prevailed in regard to their dwelling, and after a distant relation, residing in London, had administered to their effects, Ashfield House was shut up, and remained for several years without a tenant, its sinister reputation increasing as the memory of the scenes which it had witnessed became fainter. But however the prevailing rumors might have deterred others from becoming the inmates of Ashfield, they had no effect on Beaumont, when he found himself in want of a house which appeared to suit him in every respect, and although the rent was not a material consideration, yet he was sufficiently a man of the world to like a bargain, and found, in the low rate at which Ashfield was to be let, an additional inducement for making it his residence. He accordingly entered into terms with the agent. A number of workmen were sent to repair the slight dilapidations arising from neglect. The light of day again streamed through its windows, and cheerful fires blazed upon its hearths. An experienced architect examined the building, and found it fit for immediate occupation. Beaumont took possession, and the country people shook their heads. It was in the spring of the year 1830 that Beaumont went to reside at Ashfield, and for the first few months he experienced nothing that would make him repent his choice. On the contrary, as the summer drew on, he found himself in a much better position than the greater part of his neighbors, for, whereas their gardens were pillaged, and woods poached by the thieves and idle characters abounding in the district, nothing was ever touched at Ashfield. He would have been held a bold man who would have ventured there, after dark, across Ashfield Park, and fear operated too powerfully, even with such as pursued their nocturnal depredations in company. The inhabitants of Ashfield were, therefore, exempt from some of the material annoyances of country life. Their property was respected. But as summer waned and the shortening days of autumn followed, with longer shadows, apprehension began to creep into the minds of the servants of the establishment. The reports, which had been slighted when the days were bright and the nights brief, assumed, with the change of the season, an altered aspect, and the smile of incredulity became less frequent, the language of doubt less loud. There was less loitering abroad, and more concentration at home, and two were now more ready to perform the same errand than one. Indeed, there were many occupations which it would have been almost impossible to have got them to perform alone. Amongst these was the necessity of going to the stables by night, for the coachmen, grooms, and helpers all declared that they had seen the figure of a female, on more than one occasion, descending slowly through the air, from the loft to the stable-yard, a statement that appeared sufficiently absurd, but yet was steadfastly adhered to. Other stories, similar in character, were circulated, and it was not long before every servant in the house became fully persuaded of the truth of the assertion that Ashfield was haunted. Of course, the knowledge of this alleged predicament was not confined to the servants' hall. It reached Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont, but neither were disposed to give it a minute's consideration, beyond the effect which it might have upon the conduct of their domestics. Though young, the tone of Mrs. Beaumont's mind was firm, and a large share of common sense distinguished all her actions. her husband's character has already been glanced at. Beaumont laughed at the idea, saying that the ghosts had hitherto been his allies and deserved encouragement, while his wife contented herself, when the subject was adverted to by her maid, by merely calling it nonsense and desiring that nothing so silly might be named. Matters continued in this state, with ill-disguised fear on one side and indifference on the other, until about the middle of the month of October. It chanced then that business of importance required Beaumont's presence in London, and he accordingly set out, leaving Mrs. Beaumont alone. It was the first time they had been separated since their marriage, and she naturally felt the loneliness of her situation, but beyond the void occasioned by the absence of the one whom it gladdens us to see at every hour, she did not suffer from depressed spirits. There still lingered a few flowers in her garden, which she tended with care, hoping to keep them till his return. The library at Ashfield was well stocked, and she occupied herself with reading, her work, and a letter written, if not sent, every evening, combined to give her full employment. The natural tendency of her disposition was cheerful, and no superstitious feelings mingled with her serious thoughts. It was on the third day after her husband's departure when, after sitting up somewhat late, engaged in reading The Fire Worshippers, Mrs. Beaumont retired to rest. The day had been wild and stormy, but as night approached, the wind sunk, and nothing disturbed the general silence, save the pattering of the rain as it fell upon the leads. The rooms at Ashfield were so distributed that the cour du battement was completely isolated from the part where the servants slept, and this isolation was perfected by a door at the foot of the principal staircase, which was always locked inside. The sentinel on this debatable land was a pretty Blenheim spaniel, of the purest breed, which was fastened by a small chain to a staple on the wall, and made his couch upon a thick, soft rug at the foot of the stairs. He was a vigilant little creature, with a very shrill bark, which he never failed to indulge in whenever any circumstance occurred to awaken his watchfulness. Mrs. Beaumont's bedroom was at the top of the principal staircase, access to which was obtained from a square landing place, only a few feet in dimension. There were other doors upon this landing place, but they all opened into bedchambers, and were every one locked. When, according to her invariable custom, Mrs. Beaumont had seen that everything was secure, she went to her room, her only companion being a little Dutch dog, the smallest of the canine race, which never left her side. Though diminutive almost beyond conception, the little thing had plenty of courage, and seemed proud of being the guardian of his fair mistress. About an hour, or rather more, after entering her room, Mrs. Beaumont went to bed, and being somewhat tired, soon fell asleep. But her slumber had not been of many minutes' duration before she was suddenly awakened by a rumbling noise that sounded like distant thunder. At first she ascribed it to that cause, but as it gradually grew louder and louder, and seemed to proceed from the interior of the house, she was compelled to abandon that idea, though she had nothing more reasonable to substitute. Much time was not left for her conjecture. The noise rapidly advanced towards her room, as if a heavy truck or gun carriage were being dragged down a long passage, though no passage existed in the upper part of the house. On it came till, with a tremendous shock, it burst against the bedroom door with a deep, muffled sound, like a blow given to an enormous gong. At the moment his mistress woke, the little Dutch dog, equally disturbed by the noise, leapt off the foot of the bed where he slept and began to bark furiously, while the spaniel at the bottom of the staircase howled loudly and continuously, and when all else was still, made the house echo with his cries. It would be untrue to say that Mrs. Beaumont did not feel afraid. The loneliness of her situation, the suddenness of the noise, its terrific nature, added to the knowledge that access to her part of the house was almost impossible, were enough to excite fear in stouter hearts than hers. Nevertheless, she did not lie trembling in bed, but, after ringing the bell violently to rouse the servants, went straight to the door, opened it, and looked steadfastly around. Nothing was visible, though by the light that came in through the high staircase window, anything unusual might have been discovered. She threw on a dressing gown, struck a light, lit a taper, and walked around the landing place, trying the handles of all the doors, but every one was fastened. She then went downstairs, The spaniel had left off barking and lay stretched on the rug in a fit at the extremity of his chain. The door which he guarded was fast, and the key remained in the lock. Hearing the servants approach, Mrs. Beaumont opened the door and eagerly questioned them as to the noise. They all declared that they had heard nothing. It was in vain that she repeated her inquiry. They distinctly averred that, until the ringing of her bell had roused them, they were unconscious of any disturbance. But it was with no satisfied expression that they said so, and several meaning glances were exchanged, while some spoke together in whispers. Mrs. Beaumont knew not what to think. She was certain that the sounds which she had described were not imaginary. The dogs had borne evidence to the noise, and the condition of one of them afforded proof that something extraordinary had taken place. She could not suspect any trick on the part of the servants, for the only means of communication between their offices and the main building was by the door which she had found locked inside, as it was originally left. She felt persuaded that it could not have been the wind, in the first place, because the night was still, and in the next, from the peculiar character of the noise, had even the weather been stormy. Before she again retired to rest, she herself examined all the rooms on the landing place, but everything in them was the same as usual. The windows were properly fastened, the furniture and chimney boards in their places, the beds, with their folding curtains, remained untouched, and no sign or token existed to indicate that any person had recently been there. Still, she was unwilling to ascribe the disturbance to any but a natural cause, and resolved, therefore, as she could not explain it, to say no more about it. As a means of protection, in case the noise should be renewed, she desired one of the girls to pass the remainder of the night on a sofa in her room, and then dismissed the rest. Nothing further, however, occurred, and Mrs. Beaumont slept soundly till the morning. The next day she thought over the matter, and being desirous not to magnify the fears which she knew were already entertained by the household, said nothing on the subject. And although she felt perfectly convinced that her imagination had not deceived her, she was willing to believe that an explanation might eventually be found in some natural cause. She also refrained from mentioning the subject when she wrote to her husband, partly not to cause him annoyance by giving him a reason to suppose that she had been disturbed during his absence, and partly lest he should think the affair altogether too absurd for a serious consideration. As the business which had taken him to London was likely to detain him for some time longer, Mrs. Beaumont contented herself till his return by making her maid sleep in her room, in a small bed which she had placed near her own. Several weeks passed away without anything occurring to give reason for alarm, and the apprehension she might have entertained was beginning to fade away, when once more her quiet was disturbed by another visitation. It was the close of November. The night was bright and frosty, and the air perfectly still. Mrs. Beaumont and her maid had both gone to bed and were asleep, when suddenly the former awoke with the impression strong on her mind that the noise was coming. She sat up and listened attentively, and for a few minutes heard nothing but the deep breathings of the servant. Then came the distant, muttering sound, and presently the heavy, rumbling noise, clear, distinct, and unmistakable. The dog again, as on the former occasion, leaped off the bed and barked with angry vehemence. Mrs. Beaumont called loudly to the girl, who woke up, terrified in the extreme, but still in possession of her full faculties, and in time to hear the loud bang which shook the door and made everything ring in the chamber. Determined not to be the dupe of a trick, Mrs. Beaumont drew the night bolt and ran quickly into the landing place, which exhibited precisely the same aspect as before, to the very condition of the Blenheim spaniel, which lay struggling in a fit on the rug, covered with foam. Once more she tried all the locks, but without effect, and she slowly returned to her room, lost in thought and, to tell the truth, not without a feeling of dread. This feeling was more than shared by her attendant, whose energies were quite paralyzed by the nocturnal demonstration which she had unhesitatingly ascribed to preternatural influence, and earnestly begged and prayed that she might not be exposed to another visit from the ghost. Indeed, so highly excited did she become, that, a few days afterwards, she declared her intention of leaving, preferring the sacrifice of her wages to longer remaining in a house that was haunted. Her fears infected the other servants, and although they had themselves heard nothing, as they slept in one of the wings of the building, it was with great difficulty that Mrs. Beaumont succeeded in keeping them together. Shortly after this second disturbance, Mr. Beaumont came back from London, bringing with him a sister of his wife, who henceforth was to live with them at Ashfield. She was a girl of cold temperament, rarely moved to any outward show of emotion, calm, self-possessed, and a stranger, apparently, to fear. The story of the strange noises was imparted soon after the arrival of Mr. Beaumont and Miss Aline, but it was met with credence from neither. Mr. Beaumont ridiculed the idea. Miss Aline treated it with cold disdain. The wind and the rats were alternately made responsible for the occurrence, and Mrs. Beaumont, in the gladness of her heart at her husband's return, forbore to press the subject. For a considerable period her tranquillity was unbroken. It was then disturbed by an event, slightly enough in itself, but noticeable in relation to what had formerly taken place. Mr. Beaumont and Miss Aline had gone one evening to a ball in the neighborhood, Mrs. Beaumont having felt no inclination to be of the party. She was sitting alone in the drawing-room about 10 o'clock, and was reading, when the door suddenly flew open, banging against the wall with great violence. Mrs. Beaumont was very greatly startled, and looked eagerly up to see who it was that intruded so rudely, but, to her astonishment, nobody was visible. She rose hastily and alarmed to ring the bell, but the rope detached itself without ringing, and fell down in her hand. By some chance the other bell rope did not catch properly, and it was of no use, and the recollection of the former occurrences crowding to her mind, she stood beside the fireplace unable to move. While in this position, a brisk, rustling sound, like the motion of a person in a silk dress, passed quickly before her, and she felt the peculiar consciousness which is experienced when someone enters a room from whom one's eyes are averted. This feeling might have been the simple effect of fear, though the disposition of Mrs. Beaumont was usually the reverse of timorous. But whatever it was, it operated with the force of reality, producing that kind of moral conviction which leads people to testify with sincerity to what they believe to be true, though they may not be able to swear to the fact. It was some minutes before Mrs. Beaumont could overcome the strange sensation that affected her. When she did so, she hastily quitted the chamber, and called a servant, with whom she examined the apartments beyond the drawing-room, but, of course, ineffectually. The drawing-room door was also tried to see if it was liable to be blown open by a gust of wind, but the lock was in excellent order, and the woodwork unwarped. Indeed, the house had so recently been put in perfect repair, and was so solidly built, that the ordinary means of accounting for an accident similar to that described were of little service here. That she might not be accused of giving away in solitude to idle fears, Mrs. Beaumont decided upon saying nothing to her family of the fright she had experienced, and both her husband and sister remained in ignorance of the event. The next testimony given to the fact that all was not right at Ashfield came from a different quarter. Miss Aline has been spoken of as a person of unusually firm nerves. They were destined to be tried. The bedroom which she occupied was at one extremity of the main building, and was segregated by a dressing-room from that of Mrs. Beaumont. One night, having been more than usually occupied, it was rather late before she prepared to go to bed. All was silent in the house, and she was sitting before the dressing-glass, arranging her hair, when a sharp, crackling noise ran along the cornice, and before she could raise her head, the whole of the paper on one side of the room where she sat separated itself from the wall as completely as if it had been cut away with a knife, and fell down to the floor, covering the dressing-table, chairs, and other furniture with the debris, as with a curtain. It was a singular and somewhat startling occurrence, but, true to herself, Miss Aline neither screamed nor exhibited any signs of unusual emotion. Her first thought was that the wall itself was crumbling, and she hastily retreated, still keeping her eyes upon it, but perceiving that nothing had stirred but the paper. She went back and examined it, thinking to discover something whereby to detect the trick which she believed had been practiced, but the closest inspection failed to receive any mark that could afford her a clue to the manner in which the trick, if trick it were, had been accomplished. The inside of the paper was perfectly smooth, even to the very edge, and showed nothing that indicated preparation. Having satisfied herself that no danger was to be apprehended, Miss Aline quietly went to bed, reserving further inquiry till the morning, unless any other accident should intervene. All passed quietly enough. Her slumbers were undisturbed, and it was only when she went down to breakfast that she mentioned what had happened. Mr. Beaumont was greatly surprised, and all three at once adjourned to Mrs. Alline's bedroom, where the paper remained just as it had fallen. The servants, when they saw the accident, looked and whispered mysteriously, but Mr. Beaumont, who was a practical man, suspecting that natural causes had occasioned it, sent for a builder from H, who, after carefully examining the wall, ascribed the fall of the paper to the effect of the damp, which had penetrated the porous stone of which Ashfield was built. Beyond the unusual nature of the accident, there was, therefore, nothing in what had occurred that could be considered out of the pale of ordinary events, and both Mr. Beaumont and Miss Alline rallied Mrs. Beaumont on this new demonstration on the part of her ghost. She, for her part, had no hesitation in admitting the builder's explanation to be the true one, but could still see no connection between it and the singular noises by which she had been disturbed. It was not long, however, before her experience was more largely shared. The month of October came round, bringing with it the same kind of weather that had marked the decline of the year before. The night of the 29th, the anniversary of the first disturbance, was calm and still, with a small, soft rain falling, but no wind. As on the first occasion, everybody at Ashfield had retired to rest, and it might have been about 1 o'clock in the morning, when the barking of the Dutch dog, who always slept in his mistress's room, at the same moment awoke Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont. The latter pressed her husband's arm and desired him to listen. He did so, and the low rumbling noise was distinctly audible to them both. Again it seemed to approach rapidly, still louder as it grew closer. Mr. Beaumont got out of bed ready to spring to the door, but waiting till the final explosion should take place, that he might test the accuracy of Mrs. Beaumont's account. Quicker than there has been time to tell it, what appeared to be a body of enormous weight was dashed against the door, jarring the frames and staples, and booming through the chamber. Mr. Beaumont's hand was instantly on the lock. He threw the door wide open and gazed out upon vacancy. The air had scarcely ceased to vibrate to the sound, and yet there existed not the slightest possible trace to show from whence it had proceeded. Mr. Beaumont crossed the landing-place, and he had no occasion to ask Miss Alline if she too had heard the noise, for he saw her door partly open and her head issue forth, to put the question to himself. She described the sounds precisely as they had impressed both Mrs. Beaumont and himself, and he felt it impossible to suppose that their united testimony was unreal. Carefully and completely did he examine every inch of the landing-place, and of the empty rooms that opened upon it, and with equal scrutiny inspected the staircase and the hall underneath. Every door seemed hermetically sealed, and not a vestige of the footsteps or the handiwork of man was apparent. An electrical experiment was out of the question, for none about the house had skill enough to attempt it, had even the means been available, and Mr. Beaumont returned to his room, thoughtful and discouraged. He could no longer deny the existence of what he had ridiculed, though all his wit was insufficient to explain the cause. The more he pondered, the more difficult of solution did the case become, and he felt that the extremity of vigilance was necessary to make him pluck out the heart of this mystery. When the subject was spoken of the next day, he affected to treat the matter lightly, but the measures which he took showed that it weighed on his mind. It was evident, also, that Mrs. Alline was no longer the same incredulous person. Her request, that the little dog might henceforth sleep in her room, was in itself a convincing proof that the noise which she had heard had shaken her convictions. Among the precautions taken by Mr. Beaumont was that of having firearms always at hand. Every night he reloaded his pistols, and saw that the locks were in order, primed them afresh, and placed them, when he went to bed, in such a position as to be able to grasp them the instant he woke. He also had a string fastened to the handle of the bedroom door, by which means he could open it in the moment the noise should be heard, and a lamp was kept constantly burning. For several nights he lay awake until morning appeared, but his watchfulness availed him nothing. At length, on the 9th night of his vigil, it came as before, with this difference, that before the last crash he had opened the door and, quick as thought, discharged 2 barrels in succession in the direction of the sound. The sharp report of the pistols was lost in the deep thunder of the mysterious gong, and the balls were flattened against the wall on the opposite side of the landing-place. There were no retreating footsteps, no quivering wires, and but for the exclamations of the women and the barking of the Dutch dog, all would have been perfectly still. Although Mr. Beaumont possessed great strength of mind, his bodily health was infirm. He had once suffered from a paralytic affection, and strong excitement was dangerous. He felt that he was now under its influence, and strove to reason his way out of the new impressions that affected him, but in vain. The consequences were such as had been predicted. He was suddenly seized with a second attack of paralysis, and his illness became critical, but, after some weeks' suffering, by the aid of a good constitution and excellent nursing, the disease seemed baffled. On the night of the 13th of December, it fell that year on a Saturday, Mr. Beaumont went to bed, apparently in better health than he had been for the previous month. He passed a good night, but in the morning was languid and unwilling to rise. He was easily persuaded to remain in bed. Papers and books were read to him. He took his part in the conversation which arose from them, and dictated 1 or 2 letters. He dined with tolerable appetite, and towards evening fell into a sleep which lasted 2 or 3 hours. About 11:30 he awoke, and complained of a good deal of pain in his left side. Mrs. Alline had gone to her room, and his wife alone remained by him. She rubbed his side for a time, and the pain appeared to abate, but he was evidently very weak, and spoke in a low, faint tone, his utterance becoming less and less distinct, till it seemed too great an effort to attempt to speak further. Mrs. Beaumont took one of his hands in hers, and remained silently watching his countenance. While they were in this position, the clock struck 12, and about 10 minutes past the hour, the well-remembered rumbling sound drew near and came heavily onward. Mr. Beaumont turned his eyes towards his wife, and then glanced in the direction of the door. His lips moved, and he uttered a few words. "It's coming again," was all he was able to articulate, and his head fell back on the pillow. Once more there came a tremendous crash, and at the same moment the piercing shrieks of Mrs. Beaumont rent the air. It was no longer fear but certainty, and when Mrs. Alline, who had rushed from her own room, reached her brother-in-law's bedside, she found him dead. There is nothing to be added to this narrative, but the assurance that the facts described occurred as they have been related. He who can account for them will solve a mystery that, up to the present hour, has remained unexplained. Note 1. The dog never recovered from the second attack. The fits came on very frequently afterwards, and in about a fortnight he died. Fear was undoubtedly the cause of his death, but how excited is matter for conjecture alone. The end.